got the great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Dillip Simeon. Very nice to meet you.
Hey.
How are you? Now I've got so many questions for you, so we need to select, because I know otherwise the marathon might end only the day after tomorrow.
Well, you're the runner, we're just carrying the baton.
But to begin with the beginning, I wanted to ask you how it all started. How did it all start? What was your beginning?
What exactly do you mean by it?
Your work.
My work. Well, I've done all kinds of work. I've been a teacher for many years, for 20 years. And I've also written academic work, and I've written fiction. So I suppose it all started with a fascination with history. Short answer.
And were there any influences, inspirations at the beginning?
Well, I think what happened was that very early in adulthood, I became a part of the revolutionary movement, the Maoist movement. So, well, actually your question about where it all started, it could be narrowed down to 1968, the year that you were born, May 1968. So since you just managed to be born in May 1968, we belong in a sense to the same generation.
It's interesting because in the coffee break, Vivan and I had similar conversation.
So I was 18. So to be 18 in May 1968 was a very, very heady feeling. Lots of things were going on in Europe, but there were things going on all over the world. And by getting involved in that movement, it was like being carried on a kind of tidal wave of feelings and emotions. And this tidal wave carried people all over the world, and not just students, into a kind of political maelstrom. And that remained with me all my life. I don't know what it is about it, but I think it could be called a moment of radical utopia, which happens not that often. I think that in the last century it happened maybe 3 times. And to be young at that moment, it left an experience and a sense of life and almost a kind of omnipotence. You know, a feeling that you could actually do something about the world at large, about all the injustice and so on. For instance, the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War and the Palestine question were 2 political issues which led me into a kind of political mood and frame of mind. And the sense of injustice that these things evoked remained with me for a very long time. So a series of experiences stemmed from that, and those experiences in turn affected my life and thoughts. So that's what it is, that's where it began.
And it began also with your dissertation being about the labor movement in South Bihar, and I was wondering, I have discussed a lot labor movement history and archives with Jacques Rancière, whom I know you also referred to, but can you tell us about the beginnings of these investigations about the labor movements and your dissertation?
Well, in a theoretical sense, I was a Marxist, and because that led to a focus on the working class and labor, whereas in India for a long time radicalism led people to investigate the peasantry rather than the working class. This is something that inspired me to investigate the labor movement, which till then was under-researched. And I was particularly keen to study Jharkhand, which is the province which is now known as Jharkhand, but in those days it was the southern part of Bihar. But to relate to you the more dramatic part of my inquiries, it happened when I visited Jharia, the town of Jharia, which is a coal mining town. It's in the area around Dhanbad and Jharia. And if you go to Jharia, there's a coal seam underneath Jharia, a thick seam of rich coal, which caught fire a very long time ago. In fact, in my researches, I managed to date this fire. Till then, there was no date. And when you go to Jharia, you find there are entire grounds which have fallen in, literally caved in, subsided. And there are huge fissures in the ground, and ochre-colored smoke and flames pour out of this. It's almost like a vision from, Dante's Inferno or something. And it's very, very dramatic. And I remember thinking that, is this a man-made or is it a, divinely ordained occurrence? And that inspired me to actually research it. I dated that fire to 1930. And it is still raging. It's, in my limited knowledge, it's the longest lasting underground fire in the world, 1930 to now. They still haven't managed to put it out. Every once in a while, some inspired journalist tries to put a date to it and says this fire has been burning for 20 years and 30 years and so on, but it's not exactly correct. It's been raging for 80 years and more. So this kind of experience inspired me to work on what it was in the Indian economy, and did it have anything to do with the labor movement. And I found that it did, and sort of sustained inquiry led to some very interesting conclusions.
And in your recent work, violence has been a very preoccupying, kind of very present theme. And I was wondering when that started to enter to your work, and if you maybe could talk a little bit about violence and what you think are the resources to think about violence.
Well, I think when individuals become very closely and passionately involved with certain causes, and then certain aspects of those causes and movements stay with them. And I became involved with the Naxalite movement in its first phase. This is 1969-70. And the things that transpired in that movement, they affected me very deeply. And I can expand more on that, but I find that there's a great deal of romanticization of heroism, martyrdom and so on, which frankly has always repelled me, because the things that happen in the course of these kind of movements are not really very pretty. We somehow need to romanticize them in order to place some distance between ourselves and these horrific deeds. We clothe them in some kind of artistry, and we clothe them in poetry and so on, and we sing songs about them, but actually when you get close to it, it's not very pretty and it's not very artistic. This was coupled by something else which followed much later. I mean, I was in this movement for 2 years, between 1970 and 72. And in 1971-72, there was the breakup of Pakistan and a war going on between India and Pakistan. And there were very, very traumatic events. And I witnessed these events from the sort of neither end of Indian politics. We were fighting a war also. We were calling it a people's war to overthrow the Indian state and so on. And some very, very grievous things took place. But much later, when I became a teacher in Delhi University, I went through an episode in which I became the victim of a violent assault. And I must say that, when you experience extreme violence of that type, it changes you, you know. I think even when you perform a violent act, it changes you. And when you're the receiving end, it also changes you. And you can either lose your mind completely because of the sheer, let me put it this way, it's something which is so unnecessary, you know, and so tragic that it makes you wonder whether there's any sense in the world, you know. So that made me think a great deal about violence, and so it is something that I have been wrestling with for most of my adult life. Finally I wrote a novel about it, and that has just recently been published. So, well, there are certain defining experiences in life which propel a thinking person to search for certain answers.
And there is, if one reads your interviews and your texts, there is a lot also about repetition of violence, recurrence or repetition of violence. And one of the things which I was curious is if one thinks about violence of the state and violence of the left and violence of the right and these many different violences, how to deal with a certain fatigue of violence, as violence being so recurrent. What would you
How to
say
deal
about
with,
that?
sorry?
No, the idea of violence, I mean, there are so many moments of violence in your, you know, and it's recurrent. So
Yes.
the repetition of violence, and does this lead to a fatigue?
Well, I hope that the whole world should be fatigued by it and not just me.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish that one could avoid it, but we cannot avoid it because it's happening all the time, and every day you open the newspapers and there's some horrific kind of domestic violence taking place. The number of rapes taking place in this city, which is supposed to be a world-class city and you know, the capital of a superpower. I mean, the number of times I hear the word superpower, you know, and you put it against the kind of horrific violence that is going on, you wonder about the incongruity of it. So there may be some fatigue, but frankly the things that happen keep throwing this issue back at you. Even if you wish to avoid it, you can't avoid it. So as regards your question regarding, you know, all the different forms of violence, well, I am often reminded that one ought not to club together all these phenomena into one kind of whole, and I agree there are distinctions to be made. But you know, all these incidents have a kind of cumulative effect. For example, you might say that corporate capitalism is leading to global warming, but equally the burning of wood and cow dung, although it is done by poor people and you can understand it, is also contributing to global warming. So the point is that no matter what the intention and what the source, we are creating a society in which a certain kind of brutality has become normalized, and it also leads to a fragmentation of the conscience, so that we look upon the brutality of one side as the thing that ought to be focused on. We have our preferred victims. You know, there are certain people whose victimization appeals to us, and there are certain other people about whom we don't bother at all. I mean, I can just give you one example. You know, there is an Indian hagiography of revolutionary terrorism. It goes back to 1907 when some two young Bengalis called Prafulla Chaki and Khudiram Bose, they wanted to attack an English magistrate, and this happened in Bihar and Muzaffarpur in 1907, and they tracked them down to a European club where this Kingsford, the magistrate, was playing whist with another Englishman and called Pringle Kennedy, and that man's wife and daughter. And they saw a carriage coming out of this club, and they threw a bomb at it, and they thought that they'd be killing the hated magistrate, but they ended up killing these two women. They died horrible and painful deaths. One died instantaneously, and the other woman was dragged by the horse, which bolted and died the next day. Now, our entire historiography consists of glorifying these two young men, for their sacrifice. But we have completely wiped out the memory of these two white women who were killed for no reason. This is what ideologies of martyrdom and glory seeking do to us. They destroy our conscience. And my primary effort is to, I understand the difference between forms of violence, but my primary effort is to try to make us open our eyes to the sheer brutality of what we are doing.
And you mentioned before the war, and I wanted to come back to the war, and I was particularly interested about what were your thoughts on the politics of the left in India during the Bangladesh war.
Well, as regards the left at large, it's too large a question for me to comment on in detail. But the left that I was a part of was the Maoist or the revolutionary left, which believed that the rest of the left had sold out to the bourgeoisie and the ruling class and so on. And our movement was hanging on to the apron strings of the Chinese Communist Party line. And that line was that Pakistan was being unfairly attacked and undermined by unholy alliance between the Soviet Union and India. So there was a global confrontation, and in that and the eye of the storm was India, and in particular Bengal, which meant both Pakistani Bengal and Indian Bengal. And in that global confrontation, China, Pakistan and the USA were ranged against India, the Soviet Union and the incipient East Pakistan, which was about to become Bangladesh. And in that situation, the movement that I was a part of became fragmented. It became fragmented because they could not deal with the reality. They had a kind of romantic vision of what they would achieve by a people's war, but they did not really understand how to deal with the atrocities that were happening in Pakistan. As a result, there was something like 10 million people who were driven out of Pakistan and who were refugees in Indian Bengal. And the revolutionary movement was talking about defending the integrity of Pakistan. So there was a crisis of conscience. There was an ethical and political crisis, and that led to the fragmentation of the revolutionary left movement. And it also led, in my view, to permanent damage to the image of China and Mao Zedong in Bengal at any rate.
Now, this morning we discussed about actually something which is 40 years back, and I was very curious that to come back to that, because you mentioned 68, and
yes.
And you mentioned actually in a conversation, I think with Amma, you mentioned a pamphlet which you wrote 40 years ago, and the question is that if one revisits such a pamphlet today, it somehow makes a lot of sense for now. It's not really very different. So I was wondering if you could talk about this observation, because I thought that would be somehow interesting in terms
of... Which observation?
Yeah, this observation that pamphlet from 40 years ago all of a sudden seems to be as if it was written today.
Yes, yes. Yes, actually there are several such pamphlets, but...
we spoke earlier about manifestos and pamphlets, so I was curious about your pamphlets.
Yeah, well, I'll refer to just two of them. The pamphlet that I was referring to with Amar was written in 1969, and then there was another pamphlet written in 1970. And the one written in 69 was when we were students in the campus, and we talked about communalism. There was a huge communal riot in Ahmedabad in 1969, and large numbers of people were killed, and it was in a sense a state-sponsored massacre, and there were indications that certain political forces had deliberately tried to convert a caste riot into a communal riot. So the question of communal violence, which I think is a long-standing issue in Indian politics. In fact, it is, in my view, it's the central problem in India and Pakistan for the last 100 years. And unfortunately, I believe that we have not devoted sufficient thought and reflection to this problem. So that pamphlet referred to these things. And I said it could have been written today because we still have we still have problems of communal violence taking place. The latest such event was in 2008 in Odisha, when there was conflagration which carried on for a couple of months, and before that it was 2002 in Gujarat. So that is why I told Amar that this could have been written the other day.
And what would be your newest pamphlets or manifestos? Because we heard a lot of new manifestos from Vandana Shiva. What would be
I don't have any manifestos and pamphlets, no. I'm not writing manifestos and pamphlets. As I said, I've written a piece of fiction, which is not a manifesto. Some people might interpret it as a manifesto, but it isn't that.
And can you tell us about this novel?
Well, it's called, I hope you read it someday, because it's about your generation. And it's called Revolution Highway. And it took me the better part of 20 years to write. And it's a fictional representation of the political involvement of a few young people in a college. And through the life and the experiences of these young people, it tries to tell the story of a whole time. The late 60s, the music of those days, and the political movements of those days, and the passions that were ignited by the political events all over the world. So as I said in the beginning, I felt that 1968 and the years just before and after it was a kind of moment of radical utopia. So the novel attempts to evoke a sense of what it meant to be young in that moment of radical utopia. But it is steeped in ambivalence. It's not got, the one thing that is different between the atmosphere in the novel and the attitude and stance with which I write the novel, the one thing that is different is the sense of ambiguity and ambivalence. So, whereas the mood of the participants was Manichaean, that is to say, with a clear sense of right and wrong, good and evil, but the mood of the writer is that such a cut and dried division of black and white and right and wrong is not possible. So the novel is steeped in ambiguity, and I think that is what I try to capture in my writing, and that alarms certain people and it makes others think.
And I found a recent speech of yours that's also, I think, and that's my last question, something you recently wrote, which is a speech actually about Gandhi's final days. And we heard earlier a lot about Gandhi, so I was very curious if you could tell us about this seminar. It's actually a lecture for undergraduates and students on the significance of Gandhi and communalism, again communalism, and it goes all through you as a historian investigating Gandhi's very last weeks of his life, I think in particular 1 week. So I was very curious to hear more about that.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I was asked to write a lecture for an electronic lecture for students, undergraduate students, by a friend of mine who was in charge of the program. And when I began writing it, it began to turn out a little bit tedious and boring. And as I am an inveterate storyteller, and that's why I'm a historian also, I decided to tell it as a story. And when I got into reading what Gandhi said in his last days of his life, I suddenly realized that actually all this, what he said, was like his last will and testament. That struck me. I don't know if anybody has ever said it in that way, but it struck me that he was saying something, he was speaking across time and space. It almost felt as if he was speaking directly to me and to my generation. And the reason I say this is because he was summarizing all the major concerns and issues of his life in those last few weeks. So this is, say, between November and December of 1947 until January 1948. As you know, he was shot dead on the 30th of January. And actually that shooting also was in two parts, because the attempt on his life was staggered. There was one attempt made on the 20th of January, and the same group of people carried it out successfully on the 30th of January. And between the 20th and the 30th, he carried on making those comments. So one of the things that he did in the last phase of his life was he went on a hunger fast, and that was between the 13th and the 18th of January. And that was to restore a mosque to its rightful owners, and that mosque is in Mehrauli. It's now the site of a very famous festival every year called Phool Walon Ki Sair. And had he not embarked on that fast, that mosque might have become the center of another big dispute in modern India. So, I mean, I can't summarize all the things that he said in those days, but he was speaking to the people of both India and Pakistan. He was speaking as a man who belonged to neither India and Pakistan. Among the last things he said was that I refuse to take out a passport to go to Pakistan. And he was warning Indians and Pakistanis. For instance, one of the questions he was asked is, who is this strike directed against? You know, and he said it is against the Hindus and Sikhs of India, and it is against the Muslims of Pakistan. And unless they learn to live together, and unless they learn to resolve the communal question and communal animosity, both countries will pass under the rule of foreign powers again. So he said some very far-reaching and prescient things, and that is what I wanted to write in order to tell young students today that this man is not irrelevant. He's actually still speaking to us.
Thank you so very, very much, Simeon. Thanks a lot. Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Very good to meet you.